Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back here at a place that was so important in my education and where I have so many friends, colleagues, faculty, relatives, etc. So I want to talk to you about some of the transformations that have taken place in my field, mathematical ecology, and I want to first of all acknowledge the various funding sources. I won't go through them, but I certainly want to give my thanks to them. So I've been an ecologist for nearly 50 years, even though my training was in mathematics. And ecology is a subject that began with its roots in natural history. Natural history was the cradle of ecology, and it's still the foundation of the subject. But understanding ecological patterns early on meant to the investigators understanding dynamics, the interactions, for example, between the snowshoe hare and the lynx, and that meant using mathematics. And so ecology evolved. It evolved, first of all, from its roots in biology to build partnerships with mathematics, but also partnerships with physics and chemistry, and more recently, genomics. And where I think it's going, or needs to go, is to build stronger interactions with the social sciences, including economics and the humanities. So I want to break my lecture into three parts. First of all, I will give you a review, because I know most of you are not familiar with this field, with the classical advances in the subject. Then I want to turn to talk a little bit about what the computation revolution has meant to the subject. And then I want to finish by talking about prospects for the future, largely that box that I put at the bottom. Well, mathematics and computation have been revolutionizing many branches of science, certainly across biology. You all know about the great changes taking place in genomics and understanding protein structure. But for 100 years, mathematics has been making great contributions to evolution and epidemiology, and to ecology and the subject of immunology. Now, my focus has been more towards the bottom, but also on evolution and ecology. In ecology, mathematical approaches have a long history. Certainly, as I will tell you in a few minutes, in demography, the study of population growth, life history theory, which is how plants and animals in particular allocate their energy over their lifetime, behavioral ecology, and the interactions between species and how they work together to form ecological communities and ecosystems. Those are more basic subjects, but it's also made major contributions to applied topics, the dynamics of infectious diseases and optimal strategies for managing them, harvesting of fisheries and forests, conservation biology and the design of reserves, and again, a bit more recently, what's called bioeconomics, the interface between economics and biology and social systems. And I will focus a lot on that last bullet down at the end. I do want to say that in addition to the influence that mathematics has had on the development of ecology and related subjects, there have been reciprocal benefits to subjects like probability and statistics, more recently dynamical systems theory and game theory, and they have all drawn inspiration from biological topics, and in particular ecological topics, an inspiration that has pushed their frontiers and led to further developments. And I'll give you a few examples today, but they are legion. Also in operations research, the theory of search, the theory of robotics, all of that draws inspiration from biology. I think it's obvious with robotics as one tries to imitate how animals are constructed and how they perform tasks. And even as I will show you, more recently, economics and political sciences and the regulation of financial systems are drawing a lot of ideas from how biological systems are managed, how they evolved, how they function. So let me go back to what I think are the formal roots of the subject, although I will go back even a little further in a few minutes. John Grout was one of the leading demographers in the 17th century. There were others, but demography is the study of population growth, division of the population into males and females, but also how they grow over time. And what Graunt studied were the birth rates in the population. He was studying the city of London in particular, but also the major causes of death. And some of these will be familiar to, some of them less so. So you see, for example, several people died from lethargy. I'm not sure we've solved this problem, but we managed to keep people alive today. 3 people died, or no, it's 2 people died suddenly. It's not a technical term then. One person threw himself out of a window being distracted at St. Clement Eastcheap. And rising of the lights was a major problem up above there, but also you can see that 29 people, this was a major cause of death, died from teeth. Doesn't say if it was their teeth. So going back to see these studies is rather interesting. What Graunt was particularly interested in were what were the death rates of the population, what were the birth rates, and what would that mean for the growth of the population. And he recognized early on, as Malthus did, that the City of London couldn't keep growing at the rates it was. In fact, it couldn't have been growing at that rate since it was founded, or it would have been much larger. Indeed, as I said, I was going to go back a little bit further because the famous mathematician Leonardo da Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, gave an example several centuries earlier of a rabbit population which grew according to very simple rules. In his case, I should go through the details because he said, suppose the animal lives for 2 periods of time, at the end of each of which it gives birth to 1 offspring. We'll just focus on the female population. And he demonstrated that the number of pairs would be what you see on the right here, and you will recognize that this is the Fibonacci sequence. So I still use this to teach my class because it's very motivational, and the general lessons that come out of this are ones that are the foundations of demographic theory. More generally, in demographic theory, one constructs a matrix in which the elements in the top row are the fecundities of individuals in the different age classes, and the elements below in the subdiagonal here are the survival probabilities from year to year. That's all you need to describe the growth of the population. This matrix becomes multiplied times the vector of number of individuals in the different age classes and projects forward. And there's very sophisticated mathematical theory, Perron-Frobenius theory in particular, which tells you that as long as there are no zeros up the top here, this population will grow asymptotically exponentially. In other words, it will settle into what's called a stable age distribution and henceforth grow at an exponential rate. Now, if you look over here at age profiles for a variety of countries, most of them do not have the profile that you would see under these simple assumptions, and that's because the parameters are not constant. What I told you before depends, as in Fibonacci's description, on constant fecundities. But if, for example, there are changes in government policy, as in China, on how many offspring one can have, or if there are other changes that affect the fecundities or mortalities in the population, then the population will deviate from it. And this description on your left, together with graphs as you see on the right, are at the core of demographic theory. There's also, for the mathematicians, a continuous time version, continuous age structure version, usually attributed to McKendrick and Kermike, that still is the basis of study today with appropriate nonlinearities thrown in. But not only demographic theory, but evolutionary theory, 100 years ago became much more strongly quantitative due to these three great figures, Fisher, Haldane, and Wright. And this has been a vibrant area since. And the dynamics of interacting species similarly goes back 100 years to the work carried out simultaneously by the great mathematician Vito Volterra, better known for his work on integral equations, or at least better known in some quarters, and Alfred Lotka, a chemist and actuary, who developed equations to describe the dynamics of interacting species. Volterra was motivated to look at these questions by his son-in-law, Umberto d'Ancona, who ended up being one of the leading fisheries biologists in Italy. This is the book that motivated, that's not for me, that motivated Umberto's interest, which was that the fisheries of the Adriatic, the fish populations that is, went through regular fluctuations. And he turned to his future father-in-law to help him understand this, and Volterra developed the equations of the interaction between predator and prey that show these sorts of oscillations. And these equations, appropriately modified, have continued to fascinate mathematicians and indeed ecologists today. In infectious disease theory, most of the mathematical theory is somewhat more recent, but it can be traced back to the Nobel laureate Ross for his work on malaria 100 years ago. Models of the dynamics of infectious disease play an important role in management. A lot of the work in our group is on infectious diseases, in particular influenza and antibiotic resistance. And this has easily translated into applied areas of optimal vaccination strategies. Resource management, the dynamics of fish populations, or of the design, as you see on the right here, of nature reserves, is another area where mathematical theory has made big contributions. And now, of course, we're facing new challenges due to climate change. So the coupling of biological models with physical models of changes in our environment are playing an increasing role, and I'll say a little bit about them. So for all of these problems and for the related ones I'm going to talk about, I'm going to identify three what I call open grand challenges in environmental science. First of all is an understanding of what makes the ecological systems that provide us the services that allow us to enjoy our lives, what makes them robust and resilient and to critical transitions, what's the potential for the collapse of those systems. And related to that is, so systems may be robust in undesirable states. So for example, a eutrophic lake, how can we overcome that robustness? Related to that, how do we scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic, and how do we understand the emergent properties that structure ecological communities? And I know from my conversation earlier today with Professor Avis Cohen that she's interested also in the related question of how do our societies become organized and continue to function. Even though many of the forces that have shaped them are bottom up, they don't select on the whole system. Whenever one has conflicts between levels, as naturally emerges in these systems where you have individuals in societies or birds in a flock, you have conflict of interest between what's going on at the individual level and what's going on at the whole system level. And I will talk about those problems and how they arise in evolutionary biology, and particularly what we might learn about them for the challenges we're facing in the global commons, where we're all facing common problems together, but there's insufficient incentive for individuals to control their own behaviors in the collective good. So a lot of my interests recently are in what one does about that, and that's the emphasis I'm going to make on where theoretical ecology, mathematical ecology, needs to go to make more of a contribution. So I showed this video yesterday in a lecture I gave to the mathematics department. These sorts of phenomena have fascinated me for a long time. These are flocks of starlings. almost all starlings, except for this one hawk that's driving all of this activity. These animals are over, this is taken over Rome, and having gotten my degree through what was called the Institute for Fluid Dynamics here, it was hard not to look at this and think it looks a lot like a fluid. How can we scale from all of those individuals to the collective behavior, related issues of why do they engage in this behavior, what would be optimal behavior? To some extent, their behavior here is to confound the predator. So these are what we call complex adaptive systems. Ecosystems and the biosphere more generally are complex adaptive systems. And what that means is systems that are made up of a lot of individual agents who change their behaviors or are selected over evolutionary time, but they interact locally and the whole system evolves. That creates emergent properties, and those emergent properties feed back to affect individual behaviors. So the term complex adaptive systems, which is not mine, is in some ways unfortunate because it suggests that the systems are adapting, it's the agents within that are adapting. But it's not just the ecosystems and the biosphere that are complex adaptive systems, but the socio-economic systems with which they're intertwined. And that, of course, creates challenges for management. So, for example, stock markets crash, and they crash, and we've seen that, those of us who have been alive at least 10 years, as the collective consequence of individual actions. And regulation is often about how do you modify individual actions by creating incentives, et cetera, regulating trading, in order to get the macroscopic consequences that you prefer. And it's made more difficult, of course, because depending on what political party you're in, you may not have the same objectives for the emergent properties. There may also be critical thresholds in our biosphere. Are we approaching a shift in Earth's biosphere, even changes in the general circulation patterns of the ocean, losses in biodiversity, et cetera? And phenomena of this sort are widespread. I talked yesterday about this sort of phenomenon which we see in conversion to grasslands, from grasslands to forest, or in shallow lakes from oligotrophic to eutrophic state. And in general, what we see here, let's look at the upper graph, is we have some set of conditions here, and let's think about that as precipitation. And we have some measure of the state here. Let's think about that in a savanna system as the amount of grass that's in the system. If precipitation is very high, so we're out here at the right, you never get fires occurring, and so the grass state is eventually replaced by forest. If precipitation is very low, fires are frequent, and the frequent fires prevent the trees from progressing to an adult state, to a full tree state. The saplings are suppressed, and the system is dominated by grassland. But in this middle region here, we get bistability, meaning that which equilibrium you end up at depends on where you get started. And so you could flip a system from one to the other, and that flip gets easier in the face of climate change as you get closer to the boundary here. So here you could easily jump from one equilibrium to another. So one of the things we're interested in and have been exploring with mathematical models is the potential for systems to flip from one state to another. Martin Scheffer has documented many cases of this, mainly in biological systems, but not only, in his book on critical transitions. So many people examining these problems have taken inspiration from physics and from phase transitions in physics, and in particular thinking about second-order transitions in which there are early warning indicators that systems are about to flip. So look at the cartoon of the ball sitting in the landscape, and for those of us who studied René Thom's work on catastrophe theory 50 years ago, it's a very similar idea. The ball sits on the landscape may have multiple equilibria. If you push the ball a little bit, it comes back. If you push it a lot, it may end up in another basin of attraction. On a slower time scale, the landscape changes, and as the landscape changes, you may actually lose a basin of attraction. But along the way, the rate that the system returns to the equilibrium becomes slower, and that's called critical slowing down. So people look for indications of critical slowing down as an early warning indicator. And associated with that will be increasing variance, like we see in the climate systems now, increasing autocorrelation, meaning when you get pushed away, you stay away longer, and maybe the system starts to flicker between the state you're in and the new state. So this is one paper on that topic that I was involved in. I'm actually pretty excited about this topic, but quite worried about oversell of the topic, because it reminds me of what happened to catastrophe theory. Catastrophe theory was a branch of topological dynamics, really, that Avis and Marshall and Michael Fisher, who's in the front, and I were all involved with reading about 50 years ago, literally, well, 49 years ago, literally. And René Thom was interested in these sorts of transmissions, particularly in developmental systems, and he modeled this as a set of differential equations that depended on some parameters that were what are called gradient systems. The right-hand side was the gradient of a potential function, and he looked at potential functions of low order and characterized the kinds of transfer bifurcations that could take place. In particular, as the parameters of the system changed on a slower time scale. So it was very exciting and got people quite enthusiastic, but then it got oversold. The problem then is the same as the problem now. If you can show that A implies B and you observe B, that doesn't mean A caused it. There may be other ways you could get there, and that was the error was made, and that's the error that's being made again with the early warning signals. So one has to be careful. When I was a little boy, my mother told me, when I asked her, what happens to the light in the refrigerator when the door closes? And she said, there's a little man inside who turns off the light. So I tried, this was a picture of me, see, looking inside, but it never quite worked. So I think it's important to get the mechanisms right. And that means that one has to be not only satisfied with those phenomenological approaches, but with the second topic of the challenges, how do you scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic? I'll come back to talk about this simulation of forest growth in a minute, but how does pattern emerge in these systems? So we've spent a lot of time, and that was my seminar yesterday to a large extent, talking about how to understand the dynamics of collectives by developing what amounts to a statistical mechanics of these nonlinear systems. How do you take those bird flocks, give rules to all of the individuals, and then develop a statistical description of the population, moving from what in fluid dynamics would be called a Lagrangian description to an Eulerian description, or developing a Chapman-Kolmogorov description of the system. I'm interested in sustainability, and sustainability means preserving the broad features of the systems we're interested in, even though without paying too much attention to the details at the lower level. When you boil water or when you freeze water, you know that those transitions that are taking place are the results of large numbers of individual agents, molecules, banging into each other, and that fortunately somebody's worked out the statistical mechanics and the thermodynamics of these systems, or as here when you apply pressure, that describes what the transformations are going to be. You don't worry about that every time you boil water, but you know that something like that is going on. Well, we have to, for ecological systems, focus on the macroscopic features while recognizing that the control of those is resting at lower levels of organization. So for example, my colleague Steve Pacala, Dan Botkin, Hank Schugert, and others, including me to some extent, have dealt with models of forest growth in which individual trees are allowed to grow, to shade other trees, et cetera. And based on that, one can produce simulations, as you see on the right, of different tree species and the patterns that they form. Now, you saw the great variation. One couldn't possibly expect to predict where every tree will be, but you can predict with some fidelity what the statistical composition of those ensembles will be. And if you move to a broader scale, you can't even predict what the statistical distribution of species will be, but you can predict the statistical distribution of types of species, where you will find tundra, where you will find desert, et cetera. And these have been coupled with general circulation models to produce predictions of future vegetational changes on the globe in the face of climate change. And the same sort of approach, and I won't take the time to go into detail here, has been developed for marine systems, especially by Mick Follows and his associates. We've been doing some work in this area as well, in which one looks at models of nutrients, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and ultimately one ought to have fish in these models, how they move around in the system, their uptake rates, their interactions, and lots can be done. But again, here one can't predict exactly where particular species will be, but rather where particular types of species. Prochlorococcus is a large group. Diatoms, obviously, an even larger group, large eukaryotes. You can make predictions on the distribution of the globe, and these become powerful tools in understanding future scenarios. But again, one has to know what's the appropriate level of coarse graining in terms so that your predictions will be reliable. The same sorts of ideas have been applied to animal flocks like the bird flocks that I showed you, fish schools where we've done a lot of work. These are reindeer down the bottom forming this wonderful pattern. How do you scale from individuals to the collectives? Finally, I'll say that people have begun to apply these sorts of models, obviously much more difficult. This is one of our papers on the topic, to human populations, where individuals are not necessarily moving around, but they're moving around in opinion space, to a large degree being influenced by what the opinions of people they trust are. In recent years, there's been a lot of attention paid to what are called agent-based models. These are powerful tools because you can put any information you want into every individual and get them to do whatever you want. These are dangerous tools because you can put any information you want into every individual and allow them to do whatever you want. So I think this is, again, a promising area, but we really need to develop reduced dimensional descriptions of them. The classical way to do it are hydrodynamic limits and moment closure, familiar to the fluid dynamicists in the audience. Rafi Koifman at Yale and Yanis Kevrakidis have been developing data-driven methods, and there are, of course, other approaches to coarse grading and to aggregation. And finally, there's been a great deal of success. These are three of the leaders, Brown, West, and Enquist, in developing what's called a metabolic theory, where you develop scaling rules. For example, how the metabolic rate of an organism will depend on its body size. This is another way to reduce the dimensionality of the problem you're dealing with. So in the last part of the talk, I've talked about the classical theory. I've talked about the power of computation. And now I want to talk about what I think where less progress has been made, but some of the challenges in dealing with the social sciences and the humanities. So these issues that are at the interface are, how do you value natural capital? So you incorporate that into your calculations. How do you deal with public attitudes and how they can shift, and social norms? What about discounting? That is, how much you care about future generations or even your own future compared to today. What's the role for equity, both with regard to intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity today? How do we develop insurance arrangements that make it easier to preserve things? And how do we deal with public goods and the challenges there? So I will talk briefly about each of these things. So I think, as most of you know, scientific consensus on a vast range of environmental issues is strong. But we haven't taken adequate action to address them. And why? I don't think the limitations are because we don't know about the science, but it's rather that people are not willing, and governments are not willing to commit to the public good because this involves things like pro-sociality, caring about others, intergenerational and intragenerational equity, and discounting. So how do we cooperate in finding solutions that benefit everyone? This was a study that Resources for the Future, which partners with University of Maryland and Succinct down the road here, did on attitudes towards climate change. And this was about 15 or 20 years ago, but I don't think things have changed much. So the questions that were asked is, how important, do you believe that temperature has been rising? Do you believe that humans have affected this? Do you believe that we can do anything about it? And should we do anything about it? And it's rather discouraging. China and Sweden are pretty close. Let's just focus on this one box, which is, have humans affected the temperature increase? In China, 96% of the people believed that they had. In Sweden, it was 94%. In the US, it's 73%. Why are these differences so great? Is it that our education systems are not as good here? Or is it more about social norms and attitudes and the contagious nature of opinions? The central issues I'm arguing are issues of behavior and culture, issues related to equity, public goods and common pool resources, which is what I'll talk about mainly in the rest of the lecture. How do you get cooperation in the commons in which we live? What's the role of social norms and institutions like governments? Famous example is foot binding in China. This was a social norm. Everybody, at least in the upper classes, bound women's feet for many centuries. It was very robust, and then it suddenly disappeared. What sustained it, and what made it disappear? Can we study similar issues like attitudes towards smoking in public places, gender equality, racial equality, et cetera, and understand why they changed and what influences attitudes on environmental issues like climate change? And who are going to be the leaders, and how do we develop consensus? So a lot of this work is with my colleagues, Ian Cousin, who's now director of a Max Planck Institute, and Naomi Leonard, who got her degree here, and our students. So the equity issue, we discount. This is a picture my wife took of me. We discount the future. We know it's not good to eat these things, but it feels good now. Conflict between different parts of our brain, perhaps. So we discount the future, and that was at the core of understanding the importance of the famous recommendations that came out of Nicholas Stern's report on climate change. What discount rate did he use? What discount rate should he use for the future? But we also discount the interests of others. We're not here yet, but I spend a lot of times on airplanes. And can you imagine flying to China while somebody next to you with a super-powered cell phone is able to talk on the phone all the way? Those proposals have been made. You can see how happy he is about that. So with the late economist Kenneth Arrow, one of the great figures in 20th century economics and some of 21st century economics, a group of us started out to try to create a framework for incorporating natural capital into the calculations of social welfare, which generally doesn't, Arrow's argument was that markets don't work to deal with environmental issues because they don't incorporate the consequences of our actions, the social costs, the externalities. So we put that in the formula and made calculations for various countries, taking into account technology increases and got mixed answers. How do we protect ourselves, others, and future generations against the consequences of our overuse of resources? So what I want to talk about is how we go from individual adaptation and individual fitness maximization, your utility maximization, to cooperative solutions. Various kinds of insurance. How do we get cooperation at a higher level? The role of pro-sociality, the role of social norms and public attitudes, and ultimately laws, religions, and international agreements. So we're working on various parts of this, but this is a very new area for the most part. Actually, some of the great contributions here in this area were made by the late Thomas Schelling, who was, for many years, a professor or an emeritus professor in College Park. And for those old enough to remember, it was his work that inspired and allowed him to advise on the movie Dr. Strangelove. So let's just consider this problem for the beginning. Let's make it very hypothetical. Suppose you may or may not believe in climate change and you own a golf course in Scotland and are really worried about sea level rise. So your first inclination is to build a big, beautiful, fantastic wall. But suppose that doesn't, you're not sure that that's going to work, you might buy insurance to protect it. So there are various insurance schemes that we've been interested in. I want to tell you about one that was relatively new to me, introduced to me by my colleague, Jorge Pacheco, a professor of physics in Minho, Portugal, and a student of his. And this we published in the journal Mathematical Biology. So I imagine a few of you know about index insurance, but most of you don't. I didn't. Now you know, if you're a farmer and you're worried about bad weather and crop loss, you can buy insurance against it. But there are a number of disadvantages to that. First of all, you might cheat. So the insurance company has to send somebody out to check and make sure you really lost crops. And then 6 months later, you might get a check. And then, in addition, if it's a bad year and you know you've got insurance, you don't have much incentive to do anything to sustain your crop. So the idea of index-based insurance came up, which is the company says to you, well, we know if the precipitation goes down below a certain level, you have a certain probability of losing. So we'll make these calculations, and we'll just pay you based on an index of the weather and climate, whether you lost or not. And we'll work it out so that, on the average, we come out the same. Some years you'll win when you shouldn't, and some years you'll lose when you shouldn't. But on the average, everything will be fine. Now you still have an incentive to make your crop do well, because you may benefit, and you're still going to get the insurance in a bad year. You have no incentive to cheat. The company doesn't have to send agents out. You get paid right away. So we worked out the logistics of this scheme, and it works pretty well. It works well if the farmer can afford to average over various years. But if catastrophic losses can come along, then this may not be an attractive scheme. So it may work for farmers. It may not work for other situations where you might think you would apply, like an index of the level of influenza outbreaks in a particular area, that you'd be insured against that, but not insured against going to the doctor. So we've coupled this with the formation of collectives and with revenue sharing agreements that can allow individuals to average out the risk. Very nice game-theoretic problem. So just to summarize, insurance companies offer insurance based, for example, on a weather index. Individual insurance might be expensive, but you can get a group together, it's cheaper, but the company will only give it to you if you can get a large enough group. So individuals are motivated to form clubs, and and the clubs can allow averaging of risks. So you can see how this might work. I won't take you through the mathematics, but you hopefully can see that the mathematics is interesting. Another problem that we looked at with Avinash Dixit and Daniel Rubenstein. Daniel is an expert on East African herdsmen, and Avinash is a great economist. And here it's a similar problem, which is that I'm a farmer, I'm a herdsman, and conditions are not so good on my ranch. So I turn to Marshall and I say, can I send my cattle over to graze on your property? And he says, well, why should I let you do that? And I say, well, next year the situation may be reversed and you can send your cattle over to graze on my land. And he makes the calculation, and depending on how he discounts the future, he may or may not agree to that. Or he may come back to me and say, well, I don't want to take all your cattle, but you can send me 10, and I know that I can only send you 10 if the situation's reversed the next year. So again, we calculate this problem. We first of all figure out what's the social optimum. It's a mathematical optimization problem. We write down equations for the payoffs in different areas, how many cattle are going to be moved, et cetera. What's the social optimum? Is it a Nash equilibrium? In other words, is it essentially self-enforcing in a game-theoretic sense? And that depends on the discount rate. If not, what's the second best solution? In other words, is 10 the best thing for everybody, and can that be sustained? And this scheme, I think, applies to a wide range of cooperative problems. So we're trying to extend this. You know, you could apply the same thing to global agreements on climate change. You go through these steps. What would be best for everybody? Can it be sustained? And if not, are there second best solutions? And there's one other aspect, which I forgot to mention, or neglected to mention, which is Marshall and I have been friends for a long time, so he may say, okay, I'll do it for you. Prosociality may be important, especially among these herdsmen that tend to be related by marriage, et cetera. And so prosociality, caring about others, is an important part of the system. So the challenge is to maintain public goods. Public goods problems are widespread in socio-economic settings, as you see on the left, where you see fishermen competing with each other and competing with oil rigs offshore. But it also goes on in the body. A tumor growth is a breakdown of the commons in which tumor cells grow at the expense of their host. Indeed, it turns out that the tumor cells also produce cytokines that are crucial to the growth of the tumor. So there's a two-level problem, and working with the oncologists David Dingley and George Pacheco and Karina Tarnita, we have been trying to develop approaches. What David has done is to engineer cells that do not produce the cytokines or other substances. And now the question is, can we use game-theoretic methods to understand how to get them to proliferate to undercut the tumor itself? Information, as in the bird flux, is the ultimate public good. I talked about tumors. Organisms in the ocean produce siderophores and chelate substances. Why is that a public good? Well, if they're out there floating around, somebody else can steal them. Plants fix nitrogen, which they need for growth. But if I'm a plant and I drop my leaves and you're right next to me and you're another plant, you can steal my nitrogen. So it is a public goods problem. Plants produce, and bacteria, antibiotics that poison others, another public good. Antibiotics, obviously, public good in another way here is that we overuse antibiotics for selfish reasons, and this erodes the effectiveness of antibiotics in the population. And another problem we've worked on a little bit is the production of extracellular polymers, which are crucial to the growth of biofilms that keep your dentists in business. So there are lots of examples in nature of public goods. William Forster Lloyd, 2 centuries ago, introduced the idea of the commons, as you saw on the previous slide, where individuals were sharing a common ground, and nobody had sufficient interest in maintaining it. Garrett Hardin in the 1960s picked up this idea and talked about the tragedy of the commons, where the systems would collapse. The solution, he said, was mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And what he really meant was that government had to have a role in regulating things. But it turns out, through the work of my late colleague, Eleanor Ostrom, that in small communities, you don't need government to come in. They can develop ways to regulate themselves in small societies through the development of shared and mutually agreed upon norms. The difficulty is when you go to scale this up to larger populations, individuals care less about each other, the feedback mechanisms are less, and it's much harder to get that mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. So Lynn talked about what she called polycentricity, and as a solution for climate change, breaking the population up into small populations, a few countries getting together and developing agreements. These become building blocks for larger agreements. So with Avinash Dixit, I've been exploring this, and Andrew Tillman, a recent graduate student of mine, and in particular the role of prosociality in this. So this is the basic framework. This is one of the few equations I will show today. But what this says is individual I within group G has a utility, which is its payoff, which depends upon how much it invests itself, for example, in its land, and a public good to which everybody has contributed. And the framework here is you've got this payoff, which is the result of your own efforts and everybody's efforts in the collective good. There's a cost, which depends only on your own contributions. And then you may care, this gamma G is the prosociality within your group, how much you care about the payoffs to other individuals. So in the evolutionary theory of altruism, formulations of this sort are well known and somewhat controversial, but I don't want to get into that today. But we asked the question, what would the game-theoretic situation be? If there's no prosociality, individuals don't contribute to the public good. But if there's some prosociality, we find that they do, and we've published several papers on this, and this can scale up to solutions in the collective good. So we optimize the utility with respect to the inputs. The public contribution may emerge because of local prosociality, and this can induce global cooperation. I'm going to leave the point about the parents for just a moment here. Obviously, the topology of the network is important here. The modularity of the system is essential, as Lynn Ostrom said, in order to create those building blocks. So that work looks at the consequences of prosociality. The question is, why are individuals prosocial at all? So Avinash and I last year published this paper in a book showing how prosociality could actually be selected for if individuals care about their children, that one can get into a mechanism where it's sustained. Let me give some example of that. Ernst Fehr is an experimentalist. He does experiments in rooms of this sort, and I mimic these in my classroom. It always works, where he gives everybody a certain amount of resources, which they can either spend on themselves or contribute to the public good or use to punish individuals whose behaviors they don't like. And when you start playing this with a class, usually a few individuals are altruistic, contribute to the public good, others are selfish, and others punish. But everybody knows what everybody else did, and if you play this game repeatedly, you evolve towards a normative structure in which punishment increases. Even though punishment costs the individuals who are punishing, cooperation increases, and the social norm is maintained. So humans will punish others who deviate from social norms. Punishment itself becomes a norm, and so norms are really crucial to understanding much pro-social behavior. Eventually, they become formalized into rules and laws. And this is a paper we published, I guess earlier this year, on how the roles social norms play. So the last, next to last example I want to talk about is work with two former students, motivated by Lynn, and time running down, I'll go through this quickly, but basically, individuals withdraw from a public pool, whether it's fish or whether it's water from an aquifer, and they can withdraw either at a low rate or a high rate. Individuals who withdraw at a high rate are gaining an advantage, but the individuals who withdraw at the low rate band together and ostracize the individuals who withdraw at the higher rate. I will skip through the equations here, but just to show you the outcome, this is the degree of selfishness, how much more on the vertical axis, how much more selfish individuals are withdrawing than would be the optimum. And this is the frequency of cooperators. And what you see in the model we looked at is if you can get the frequency of cooperators above a threshold level, you can sustain a cooperative equilibrium. And this is the principle that underlies a lot of international agreements on climate change. They only go into effect if the number of signatory nations is above a critical level. Once you do that, you can regulate the commons. And working with Andrew Tillman, my student who just finished a month ago, we're also looking at second best solutions. Maybe trying to sustain the social optimum is too much. So again, I only want to emphasize here that the modular structure is crucial and provides building blocks. This is an idea that Lynn Ostrom has developed in her polycentric approach. It's very similar to what Bill Nordhaus calls climate clubs, trying to create smaller assemblages. And generally people think about these in a hierarchical way, but with Pacheco and two of our students, we've been developing models that takes into account the fact that nations, in particular, have multiple overlapping alliances with each other. So the US belongs to NATO, it has agreements with WHO, et cetera, et cetera. And every decision you make within one alliance affects the balance within another alliance. So we allow an arrangement in which individuals can join groups. If they're in those, if you're a cooperator, well, if you can be an outsider here and pay nothing, or you can join a group and be a member, and then if you're a member of a group, like a member of NATO, then you can decide, let's say, to mitigate or not. So there are three levels, and we show again that the modular structure and the ability to belong to multiple consortia actually makes it more efficient, easier to get international cooperative agreements. So let me conclude with just a couple of remarks. Modeling collective decision-making and the sorts of things I've been talking about, I think represents a new frontier in theoretical ecology. How do ideas get propagated? How do social norms develop and spread? Michel Gervin, who's here, and I worked many years ago on these sorts of issues. How do we get collective action in dealing with these problems? Attitudinal shifts in social norms can happen dramatically, and I talked a lot about this yesterday, and affect action on issues like climate change. In human societies, as in other animal groups, there really are generally few leaders, and most individuals are, to some extent, followers, turning to others to ask, how shall I vote on this? What should my opinion be on this? Closely related to this is the dynamics of political polarization in our society, a separate issue in which very little has been done. Sudden shifts in attitude can be given momentum by these large numbers of followers, and if we're going to, in dealing with environmental action, we have to take into account these sorts of shifts. Groups form, and these create modules for better cooperation. The ideas of polycentricity that Lynn Ostrom developed, I think, have great potential. Ecological systems and socio-economic systems alike are, as I began this lecture, complex adaptive systems built up of agents organized into groups, maybe overlapping groups. So the great challenges for us are, how do we develop a statistical mechanics of these communities and of the socio-economic systems of which they're part? How do we understand the emergence of pattern on multiple scales? Can we develop indicators of impending critical transitions? And most challenging, I think, how do we find pathways to governance in the multi-scale commons? So as I began, multiple mathematical ecologies had a rich history going through all of these sorts of things that I won't repeat here. Moving forward, there are a new set of challenges I think we have to address. Ethics and equity, societies in these attitudinal shifts, pro-sociality, and in particular, the problems of commons. These are old challenges, but they have new dimensions to them. Galileo said that the universe is written in the language of mathematics. And my conclusion still and hope is that we continue to anticipate and enjoy what Wigner called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences and to extend it to these social science issues. So thank you very much. So I'm happy to take any questions or objections. Yes, John.
So the data wrote the paper is trust is a catalyst for collaboration.
What is?
Trust is a catalyst.
So who wrote the paper in 1974? Okay, then it's right. So there are three different parts to your question I'd like to answer. First of all, I think trust is very important, and an example of the success of this is the Montreal Protocol, one of the most, that dealt with the elimination of chlorofluorocarbons, one of the most successful agreements, and it worked because of trust. But I think you have to understand what trust means in this case. Trust doesn't necessarily mean that I think you're doing the right thing because you're a good person. It's because there are enough safeguards in the system that I trust I know what you're going to do. So I think trust is crucial to the agreement. And to the other points you made, and I apologize to the people who were in my lecture yesterday because I want to give the same example that I gave there. There's a game that's played called the ultimatum game, in which I give you, let's say, $100,000, and you have to share it with that person in the back whom you don't know, and whom you'll never see again, but that person understands the rules of the game. You decide how much you want to share with her. You can give all of it or none of it, or $30,000 or whatever. But if she accepts it, then everything's fine. But if she turns you down, neither one of you gets anything. There's no negotiation that goes on. So I play this game in my class, and I gave one student, I said, I didn't really give him $100,000, and he offered $30,000. And she said she would reject it. I said, it's going to cost you $30,000. She said, yeah, but it's going to cost him $70,000. So the reason this is relevant to the point you made, I mean, she was sustaining a social norm, is that you, as the donor, have two calculations, exactly the two that you made. One is, you're playing a game and you have to decide, is she going to accept it or not? And secondly, you have to decide on the basis of fairness how much you should get. In fact, people who have done experiments on this then sometimes replace this with something called the dictator game, in which she doesn't get a choice and you decide. And in some circumstances, you may not know this, but you become more generous in those situations, because now it's just down to yourself, your reputation. You're no longer playing the game. She's got a different computation because she's not playing a game, or at least she's not playing that game. If she turns you down, it's because she's embedding it in some broader framework in which she's sustaining a social norm. So the points you made are very relevant there, but that had nothing to do with trust. And by the way, what people offer and what people will accept varies a great deal from culture to culture. Very interesting. Americans turn out to be relatively generous. And Right. Yeah, well, of course, in the collaboration game, too, there's uncertainty about what the other person's outside options are. And so that's where mechanism design theory has come in. But it's a very rich area mathematically, and I think has a lot of implications for ultimately how we get international agreements. So, yes?
So in neuroscience, you have a lot of knowledge about cell molecular mechanisms, a lot of knowledge about systems behavior, cognitive emergent properties. And one of the big challenges is showing how these things link up. These equations which you're using where you have individual entities and then you can put together a flock, I mean, do you think they'll be that kind of?
I've talked to a lot of the birds, and they don't seem to use these. I certainly think it's helpful in many of these. First of all, interestingly, this is just an aside, those bird flocks that look three-dimensional are really more or less two-dimensional, and they move as sheets through the system. A lot of these populations, especially fish populations, go through bifurcations in which they be moving laminarly, and then they go into balls and things. And these sorts of models have been helpful in understanding when they will do that. We'd like to extend these models to human decision making, but obviously that's much harder, although we've got some halting efforts in that direction. Do I think they'll be useful? Well, it depends on what your objective is. There are lots of reasons we do science. One is to increase our understanding. Another was to make predictions about future events. And the third, at least, is to how do you manage. And the fourth may be just to use them as sort of training mechanisms for people. And I think there are uses of all those dimensions, but obviously prediction, especially about the future, is hard.
The understanding is the big one.
Oh yeah, I think we've already seen because we don't just use these as models, but couple them to experimental systems. So they suggest experiments and that can feedback. So I think they've definitely been very instructive in understanding what's going on. My former postdoc and collaborator, Ian Cousin, has a fish lab where he trains animals to targets, and so we're able to go back and forth, or he's able to go back and forth between the experimental and the theoretical. It's been very useful. But of course, the problems are identical to the sort, in many ways, to the sorts of problems you're facing in understanding brain activity. How all the cells and positive and negative interactions between them, and how. Well, I wasn't even going to that level, but to vision and things of that sort. But language, of course, is an emergent property at a different level. And people who've, that's the sort of thing Chomsky and others do, is understanding how local rules of grammar give rise to interaction to the broader patterns. Yeah. People do that. The question is how much it should be believed. I think models of that sort can suggest possible outcomes. Maybe can suggest the right sign to things. I think eventually we may be at that. Obviously, I think for some simpler problems, like the regulation of a fishery, particular fisheries, that these models can be used and have been used to produce answers in the correct direction. Jane Lubchenco, who was the head of NOAA, and I, and two of her students published a paper in PNAS about a year or two ago on what are called rights-based approaches to fisheries regulation, and pointing out that these have been very successful. They're more or less motivated by models of this sort. I don't know that anybody has depended upon a specific quantitative projection of what's going to happen, but the models demonstrate that this is a feasible mechanism. Same thing with climate change agreements and things of that sort. They help you to understand the importance, the importance of viewing these as coordination games versus things like the prisoner's dilemma. I'm certainly hopeful of moving in the direction that you talk about, but I'm very suspicious of models that claim too much in these directions. It's not a very satisfactory answer. But certainly there are a number of government agencies that are interested in these issues. I'm on the board of mathematical sciences and analytics of the Academy, and it was just down here last week for a meeting where a number of government agencies were coming in and describing their problems and asking for help with it. I think in financial regulation, I would have much more confidence in this, and I've been working with a guy named Andy Lowe on developing those schemes. Yes? Oh, well, we certainly do that, and you might just look at Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, in which he documents many cases of that sort. Easter Island would be an example of that. You know, there are always lots of factors going on, but it's not my area, but certainly there are lots of examples, at least claimed, where the overuse of resources has caused the collapse of societies. Obviously, you know of examples where the spread of infectious diseases has, at least in small societies, has done that, or has had devastating effects on large communities. So, short answer is yes, but look at collapse.
So in the context of these macro relationships, you know, it's a folk observation that the IQ of the crowds drop a whole lot more than the individuals. You take a whole bunch of smart people, put them in a crowd.
You're talking about the wisdom of the crowds, aren't you?
Intelligence of the crowd, or the behavior of the crowds.
Yeah.
And is that a provable theorem, or is it provable observation, and what's the mechanism going on there?
I'm not sure I got the question.
So if you take a whole bunch of smart people, put them in a crowd,
yeah.
it seems like the intelligence drops. So is that a provable observation, or is it and what's the mechanism?
I don't know. We could take a test here by asking some questions. There are many.
I wouldn't characterize this group as a crowd, by the way.
Well, one thing I've been interested in but not done any work on is how good prediction markets are. And there's a little bit of a literature developing on that. Scott Page has written a book called, well, I don't remember what it's called, but he's done work claiming at least that diversity per se actually improves collective performance. So there's been criticism of his analysis of this. It's far enough outside my area that I don't have any idea. Well, I don't see any reason to think that people get dumber in crowds, but I think it's certainly the case that that individuals that are in groups are unwilling to use their intelligence sometimes because the political pressures within the group create a pressure to conform. I think that's what's at the. There's been a phenomenon, certainly in the U.S. but elsewhere as well, of increasing political polarization in our societies. You know, there are lots of issues that are important in politics in the United States. How is it that we're really, to a first approximation organized along a one-dimensional continuum, left and right. How did that happen? I think most of us would agree that it's not a good thing because individuals who deviated from the social norm may be punished. And I think to some extent, it's related to understanding why individuals organize themselves into groups. When you're in groups of any kind, there are often collective benefits, so you join the group, just like the bird flocks. In order for groups to survive, they have to impose structures that say don't marry anybody from that other group, don't talk to anybody from that other group, because otherwise you lose individuals who move back and forth, and that this forces a rigidification on the group structure, and that forces us along a one-dimensional axis. So you either accept everything over here or everything over there. In other societies that have somewhat different political systems, there is the potential for a few other dimensions. But in general, I think we become very polarized. And if that's the answer to your question, I think that polarization doesn't make people dumber, but it makes them less willing to use their own brain. So maybe in that sense it makes them dumber. But that's as far as I want to speculate on that topic. Yeah.
Well, let me thank Simon for that stimulating lecture and
I have a bag like that. Oh, it's thank you
offer
very
this
much.
token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for staying. It was very enjoyable.
Thanks very much.